start to thank all the organizers and our hosts here. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in Estonia for two reasons. One is because of the wonderful colleagues that we have here. I flew in from New York this morning, arrived, and they said, well, we'll take you to the hotel. And I said, no, I want to get there right away so I can hear Fritz Scharf and Nina Mayone. And I hope you enjoyed them as much as I did. And secondly, because I've never been to Estonia, so I'm looking forward to spending the weekend with my son, who's studying elsewhere in Europe. And since this is the lunch hour, or just after lunch, I thought maybe we should say something provocative. So that's what I propose to do. There's been much doom and gloom at this conference, as there is in every conference that one goes to on Europe in recent years, about all the crises that beset Europe. And I think in general, those crises tend to be exaggerated in their severity, with the possible exception of one, the Euro crisis. But that's a topic for another time. One of the things that is exaggerated, I think, when people discuss international affairs nowadays is the effect of populism on foreign policy. So I want to argue that populist foreign policies are really, as we would say in the English idiom, all bark and no bite, that they talk a good line, but they don't actually deliver policy change, and therefore are doomed to disappoint. And I want to argue that on two examples, Trump and Brexit. So let me be very clear about exactly what it is I'm arguing. I'm arguing that democratic populism, so we could talk about Putin. Oh, my mic is off. Yeah, sorry. Now can you hear me? Good. Democratic populism is destined to be unsustainable in the 21st century. And specifically, populist leaders fail to implement their concrete promises. Instead, they eventually adopt or extend their predecessors' policies. Now, let me be precise again about what I'm saying. I'm saying they really fail to implement the policies. Not that they fail to achieve the broad goals that they set forth for society, because all politicians disappoint in that way. But they literally cannot enact the very specific policies or they choose not to enact the very specific policies that they promise. And they eventually, therefore, end up adopting or extending the policies that their predecessors had. And again, this is in democratic populist societies. So what I propose to do is look first at Trump, then look at Brexit, show you that this has been the case, and then I'm going to argue it had to have been the case. It was inevitable that they should fail in this way. Okay, so let's start with Trump. President Trump has implemented, I will argue, almost none of his concrete foreign policy promises. He made a lot of them, and he's not on track to implement them. And the consequence is that American foreign policy today, if you go issue by issue, looks a lot more like the Obama-Clinton policy than it does like what Trump promised in the election, or in fact, even sometimes within his own government, wanted to achieve. To see that that's the case, here's a map of the world, and let's start going issue by issue. So the first issue that he flip-flopped on was China. That was in the first couple of weeks of the administration, where he claimed he was going to take a tough line and sanctions, brand them a monetary violator of monetary norms and so on. But then flip-flopped almost immediately when he realized that China wasn't really a monetary violator anymore or an exchange rate manipulator, and he needed their help anyway to deal with the Korea crisis. Then there's Afghanistan. So this is an issue Trump really cares about. So if you, I'm going to go through all these circles and bring them back later in a second, but this is Afghanistan. So in 2013, Trump said, let's get out of Afghanistan. We've wasted billions of dollars, thousands of lives, and all these people come home, soldiers and so on, they have post-traumatic stress disorder and so on. And he went on a rampage tweeting against Obama on this issue very consistently. Already by the time he was competing in the Republican primaries, he was a little more cautious. So his public statements softened a bit. He said it was a terrible mistake to get involved, but I would leave the troops there begrudgingly. But he didn't actually mean that. In fact, once he got into office, he tried for 7 months, almost a one-man effort inside the White House to get the United States to find a way to pull out of Afghanistan because he really thought it was a mistake. And he did that for 7 months, opposed by various people within the government, the Pentagon, his own political advisors, and so on. And then, in a speech in the middle of August, August 16th, I think it was, or 13th, there's hardly a day on the calendar when fewer people are listening to a presidential speech than this day. It was very carefully chosen for that reason. And he gave a speech saying, well, we're going to actually increase our number of troops in Afghanistan from 8,000 to 12,500. And it's almost humorous to read what he said. At this time, he said, well, decisions are really different when you sit behind the desk in the Oval Office. The consequences of it, and then he started talking like every American president talks ever since Vietnam, when you're involved in a war that you can't win but you don't want to lose. The consequences of a rapid exit are both predictable and unacceptable. The US must seek, you can hear the echoes of Richard Nixon in Vietnam here, seek an honorable and enduring outcome worthy of the tremendous sacrifices that have been made. So you get post-factual election promises and then very factual policies. All right, back to the map of the world. So we've done China, we've done Afghanistan. What's next up? Yes, Japan. So we had, across the board, also with regard to NATO, which we'll get to in a moment, promises on Trump's part that the United States would fundamentally rewrite the arrangement that the United States has with major allies, that it was okay if countries like like Japan or Germany got nuclear weapons, but the United States was being exploited by these countries and so on. That policy changed about a month in to the administration, and you notice that Trump's recent discussion of Japanese defense and the US-Japanese alliance are almost exactly what presidents have said for the last 30 years. Then we have NATO, same deal. I was at the Munich Security Conference, I think that was the 3rd week in February last year, when Vice President Pence and the Secretary of Defense came and said, in the name of the President of the United States, we are reaffirming our commitment to NATO, we are sound allies, and so on, and kept on saying that even as Madame Merkel was subtly insulting the American view of the world at the time. So now our NATO policy is pretty much the same, and it's wrong to argue that any recent increases in European defense spending are a function of Trump's pressure. What's next? Yes, Korea. So Trump was, I'm going to trip over this pretty soon. So Trump thought that there were other options in Korea. Still occasionally talks as if there are other options in Korea, military options. So again, I'm going to zip through this slide. Don't worry, there'll be another one. North Korea will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. And his national security advisor was authorized to say in the name of the president, there is a military option. Accepting North Korean nuclear weapons and their ability to hit the United States is unacceptable. Trump will not accept this. But as the North Koreans have taken steps forward to achieve that capability and arguably have that capability now, what did Trump do? He backed down. So there's the possibility at some point the United States will suddenly strike at Korea, but the fact is the United States doesn't have a lot of military options, and Trump saying that they do doesn't create them. All right, so we've done 4, 5, 6, yes, Trans-Pacific Partnership. So here, Trump did do something sort of. He pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But notice that there was nothing distinctively Trumpian about that position. It was Clinton's position, and it was the general opinion at the time that the Trans-Pacific Partnership in that form could not get through Congress. You might be able to argue that over the longer term, Clinton might have found a way to reform it down the line and push it through Congress, but at least in the short term, there's really no difference between what Trump did and what Clinton would have done had she been elected. Russia and Ukraine. Now, the President of the United States has a relatively ambivalent policy toward Russia, as we all know. But the interesting thing about it is that he, again, inside the White House, pushed for a policy of being much more accommodating toward Russia, about watering down the sanctions, didn't say anything about Ukraine, and piece by piece, that's been subtly reversed. The United States is now gung-ho about the sanctions. In fact, in certain respects, Trump has said we should be making more of a deal of what's going on in Ukraine, or went on in Ukraine. And so the policy is now reverted to the kind of ambivalent policy. And don't forget that the conventional wisdom in Washington was, in fact, that if Clinton had been elected, there would have been some effort to reach an accommodation with Russia anyway. So this is pretty much on track. What's next up? Oh, yes, Brexit. So we'll get to Brexit as an issue by itself in a moment. But Trump said he was going to help the British, that he was on the side of the Brexiteers. He made a special trip during the campaign to talk about it at his golf course up in Scotland. And what's he done for Theresa May recently? Well, he insulted her in print and in tweets. And he did not deliver on his one big suggested promise of something he could do for the British, which was sign a trade agreement with them. In fact, the United States has gone back to politics as usual, which is picking trade disputes with people on the basis of special interest pressures in the United States. Britain is now facing rather aggressive pressure from the Trump administration, both on agriculture and on smaller aircraft. In fact, if you think ahead, it's pretty impractical to imagine that you would have a US-British trade agreement. It's almost impossible to get trade agreements through the US Congress. And what Britain would face would be an avalanche of special interest pressures from the United States, starting with agriculture, if that were to happen. And Trump can't do anything about that. What's next? Oh, yes, NAFTA. So Trump argued that the United States should threaten and make good on pulling out of NAFTA if there weren't any changes. Now, this is an area where at least there's a process underway. I think we're in the, I forget what it is, 6th round of negotiations between Canada, US, and Mexico on NAFTA. But so far, concretely, all that's happened is disputes about the kind of goods that the United States and Canada are always disputing about, namely softwood lumber, steel, things like that. And increasingly, the news reports out of the White House are that Trump is being increasingly persuaded by his assistants that there's a lot of essential trade between the US and Canada, say in the automobile sector, and you can't do anything about it. Then we have Mexico. So very famously, Trump said the United States was going to build a wall and Mexico was going to pay for it. And the way we were going to do that is we were going to threaten, the United States was going to threaten Mexico to get it to pay for this. So one of the very first things that happened when Trump got into office is the Mexican president told him to go to hell. Why? Because he would have been kicked out of office if he paid for a wall between the US and Mexico. And now the debate in the United States is entirely about how much wall there is going to be and how much the American taxpayers are going to pay for it. Then we have Syria and Iraq. So here, Trump was sort of bimodal. He said, on the one hand, we really shouldn't be there, but that once we're there, we should blow them away and do more. And you can argue that Trump did a little bit more. So again, I'm going to jump forward. If you look at the number of air sorties flown, so this is sorties against ISIS, the number of sorties, that is waves of planes, Sorties with weapons released, as opposed to just flying out there and not finding the target, and then the total weapons. So it's a very interesting pattern because what you see is that the number of sorties, does this have a, doesn't. The number of sorties flown, the number of missions that the US flies, and the number of weapons it drops doesn't increase at all. In fact, it goes down slightly because this is all Obama to here, right? And then it actually goes down slightly. The only thing that goes up is the number, the tonnage of weapons that are released, which looks like a policy that is slightly more aggressive, although as you can see, the trend line is even more steeply up in the Obama years, but largely symbolic. That is, you're flying the same number of sorties against the same number of targets, just releasing a few more bombs so you can claim to be doing something. All right, back to the map. Where were we? Yes, so then we have human rights issues. So Trump claimed famously that the United States should tear up any kind of restrictions on torture and interrogation techniques, and was almost immediately reversed by the military. So that's a kind of global thing. Then we have, what's this one? Yeah. Oh, Iran, right. So Trump decertified Iran, saying that it's not in compliance with the nuclear treaty. Now, the interesting thing about decertification is it's one of the things the presidents can do that has no immediate effects whatsoever. So decertifying Iran simply says this is the view of the President of the United States. To actually do something to change the status of that agreement, he would have to get a vote in Congress. Now he's trying to pressure Europeans to slightly tighten up the regime. But again, compared to the promise, which you recall in the election was, the first thing I will do when I go into office is tear up the Iran agreement, it doesn't amount to much. What's next? Let's see. Oh, yes. Then there's climate change. So that's another great symbolic issue. You pull out of the Paris Accord, which the United States had carefully negotiated in such a way that it didn't actually oblige the United States to do anything. So you're pulling out of a political process, but you're not actually changing policy in any immediate way. In any case, most of the meaningful climate change policy in the United States is pursued by states and cities. And we got one more here. Oh, Israel, right. So, so there again, you get a symbolic policy. You move the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Of course, the US embassy had de facto always been in Jerusalem, is much bigger than what was in Tel Aviv. The United States just didn't simply choose to call it that. So again, it's a change of sorts, but it's really a rhetorical change, not a real change. That's Trump's foreign policy achievement, okay? And he's done almost nothing different in foreign policy except change its tone from what a Democratic administration would have done. And I think that's quite typical of how a populist in the United States has to operate. Now, let me just make a few qualifications so you don't think I'm saying populists make no difference in the world or something like that. Number one, he can do symbolic things. So you notice there were a few things like moving the embassy or climate change that are symbolically important, just don't constitute real policy change. And as I'll argue in a moment, that's the optimal policy for a populist. You want a policy that doesn't really have any effect, but looks like it does. That's perfect for them. Also, he can do things that involve the organization of foreign policy that are supported by a Republican Congress and have always been supported by a Republican Congress. An example is reallocating from civilian to military spending, so taking resources away from the State Department or AID, giving them to the Defense Department. The president can do that. In fact, every Republican administration has done it. He's done it a little bit more than most. But he can make domestic resource choices of that kind if supported by the congressional party. And then there's some gray area policies that you might think of as foreign policy but don't really involve immediately another government. like the treatment of migrants in the United States or tax reform, which might have large effects on the rest of the world. And he has some impact on that, although, of course, there's a very strong argument that Trump hasn't achieved much in domestic politics either. Crisis management. So the President of the United States has a lot of powers in a crisis. And we haven't had a crisis yet, really, except the Korea one, which wouldn't support the idea that he's going to do something crazy. But it's conceivable in a rapid crisis that Trump might be in a position to do something that would be really quite strikingly different than what somebody else would do. If you look at the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it certainly mattered that Kennedy was President of the United States. And finally, non-decisions. There are things Trump could be doing that he's not doing. Exercising American leadership around the world is the way people talk about this in Washington. And so all these things are things where Trump might have a kind of peripheral effect on American foreign policy, but basically his effect is pretty marginal. All right, now you go to Brexit, and what you find out is it's the same story, right? That the Brexiteers promise a good game and deliver nothing, okay? And this is known in the people who read the economist literature as the California effect, okay? Here's the argument. Whatever the future legal status of the UK, almost all the substantive policies associated with Brexit are unlikely ever to be implemented. And this is the Hotel California effect. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. So the British can change their formal status. They can change the way we talk about British membership in the EU, but they cannot change the policies. And to a surprising extent, they're no longer even trying to change those policies. So let's look at the status of the Brexit negotiations here. Okay, so 90% of the policy the UK doesn't really want to change. It's actually now the UK that's defending customs unions' rights against the EU. They don't want to change information sharing about terrorism and internal affairs. They don't want to change the mutual recognition of services. They don't want to change the defense relationship. You can go down the list, and there's actually relatively few things that the UK is truly committed to change. What's more, even if it is truly committed to changing them, it can't. The UK is just too small. It's kind of basic undergraduate international relations, week 2, when you do Cohen and Nye, asymmetrical interdependence, that if you're exporting 4 times as much as a percentage of GDP as somebody else is exporting to you, you're in a bad negotiating position. And that's in the negotiating position the British find themselves in. And it's therefore been just backing down one issue after the next over the last year continuously. Now de facto is in a position of having accepted Europeans in Britain, the role of the ECJ, if only indirectly. They've now got a backup plan that would just accept the entire customs union and forget about negotiating it. Schengen information sharing, the transition gets longer and longer, so that every session they get into, they lose, which is exactly what you'd predict from basic IR theory. And one reason is that they're not only weak vis-a-vis Europe, but they lack any viable alternative. So the Tories talked a good game about how you could go sign trade agreements with the United States or China or India. Even if you signed a trade agreement with all 3, that would be less than 20% of British exports, and exports to the European Union are almost 50% of British exports, so it wouldn't offset the cost of Brexit. But more importantly, it's bad enough signing a trade agreement with the United States. As I mentioned, it's not something any sane person would try to do. It will take you decades to achieve it. And the only thing worse is trying to sign a trade agreement with China or India, which in any case are only 4% of British trade. Some Tories said, oh yeah, well, we have the alternative to create a completely deregulatory Singapore-like state on the Thames, and that idea has disappeared as well. Why? Because popular and parliamentary majorities oppose hard Brexit. They don't have the votes in their own country to do that. Other countries aren't following the UK example. You don't hear Orban does a lot of things that are outrageous, but he doesn't threaten to pull out of the EU. And so the only remaining questions are, will Brexit happen at all? If so, what will be the legal form of that relationship? And what few policies might the UK be able to bargain to change? This was all foreseeable, and some of us wrote that before the referendum even took place. So we see that both Brexit and the Trump presidency, almost across the board, to a striking extent, failed to achieve anything that they said they were going to in foreign policy. So there's only two questions remaining. One, why? And secondly, why does everybody think that they're so much more powerful than they really are? Okay, so to understand why populists must disappoint, not just happen to disappoint, and then why we perceive them as successful. Okay, to understand why populists must fail, you have to think about what populism is. Okay, populism is not a substantive set of goals. It's not a political movement that makes policy for the people. It's not opposition to establishment politicians. It's not favoring some kind of specific policies, because every political movement does that in one form or another. It's a style of political discourse and appeal, style of rhetoric. And it's based on three principles. One is that the truth is simple, that the public should circumvent expert or elite advice. Chris talked earlier about the famous Gove quote in Britain that the public, how does it go? People in this country are tired of experts. Well, Michael Gove is now, I think, Minister for Rural Affairs or something like that. He's been demoted to almost invisibility on the spectrum. But British Brexit policy is being driven by experts. So as we'll see, there's a problem with this view. Secondly, identity. That those simple ideas come from a particular place, according to populists, and that is communal beliefs and values, not concrete calculations of interest. And that's why you get these appeals to national, racial, or class identity. And finally, they're anti-pluralist. They believe that unilateral solutions, the solutions of one political party or one nation, are superior to compromises, difficult compromises with political opponents or foreigners. Okay? So what's the problem? Why must foreign policies fail? They fail because they have to be implemented. And when they have to be implemented, you're no longer in a world where it's plausible to say policies are simple, policies can be implemented without compromise, and so on. The opposite becomes painfully true, and particularly in foreign policy. First of all, policy implementation is incredibly complicated. You can't do it without experts, which is why the Trump White House has been hamstrung by trying to do it without really trusting any of the establishment experts, because it's extremely difficult. And it turns out that all those details and ambiguities and trade-offs and what lawyers tell you about what will happen really matter. Secondly, policy's concrete. It's not symbolic. It rests on the management of tangible interests, often of elites. And when you actually talk about changing a concrete policy, they all come out of the woodwork and try to influence that policy, if not directly, then through Congress in the United States. And third, policy implementation is cooperative. You never get 100% of what you want. You're always making deals with other people. And these three things are particularly true in foreign policy. So in foreign policy, these compromises with complexity and concreteness and compromise, these things are magnified. Why? Because in foreign policy, issues are particularly unfamiliar, counterintuitive, complicated. Only experts understand a lot of these issues. Secondly, they're very concrete. Very few foreign policy issues, when it gets to the implementation, actually interest anybody in the electorate. So beyond avoiding a costly, visible failure, like losing a war, which is why Trump didn't want to pull out of Afghanistan, powerful and diverse economic, bureaucratic, and political elites dominate the actual making of policy. And you can't do without them. Finally, you've got to compromise. And this is perhaps the biggest difference in international affairs. An international policy is almost by definition a policy where you reached an agreement with another country. and that other country has to agree. And the only way to leverage your power, the only ways to leverage your power to get them to agree, take the case of Mexico agreeing to pay for the wall, is to coerce them. And coercion is expensive. You don't get it just by winning an election. You actually have to pay high costs. And the result is people are incapable of doing that and don't achieve it. So that's why populists fail. You can think about Brexit. Complicated, incredibly complicated for those of you who studied the issue. Very concrete with all these special interests, accountants in the City of London and so on, having their say. And ultimately, the subject of international bargaining. And that's what wears down populists. It's not that they face some kind of deep state that subverts them or something like that. These interests are real. You can make up facts when you're in an election. You can even make up facts when you're running the country and tweet them out. But you can't make up facts on the ground when you're making a policy. And eventually, populists hit that wall. So final point. Final point. Why do so many people believe populism is succeeding, even in foreign policy, if it isn't? And the answer is because they make the same mistake that populists make. They mistake talk for action. And they report it. So let's just look at who these people are who do this. And now I'm going to be criticizing us, in part. Okay? So who are these rhetorical fellow travelers who talk and create a public atmosphere where we perceive populism to be achieving gains in foreign policy that it's not? All right. The interesting thing is, it's not just populist politicians who hype their policies. That's obvious, right? Trump tweets out that he's got the greatest policy America's ever got, right? It's the opposition. The Democrats in the United States have a tremendous incentive to make it seem as if Trump really poses a threat, because that's how they're going to get people to come out and vote in the 2018 elections. So you get no politicians. Politicians may say Trump's good, they may say he's bad, but nobody says he's unimportant. Second, journalists, commentators, and policy analysts. Now we're getting closer to home here, right? They report what politicians say, much more rarely what they do, which is complicated and obscure and long-term, and almost never what they don't do. So you don't get really any sense of what the real policy is. This is particularly striking among journalists who really highlight worst-case speculation. There were recently, we were talking about this at lunch, postmortems about American media coverage in the last year. And people said, yeah, it was totally different than my experience ever was before as a media person. We just waited till 4 o'clock when Trump tweeted stuff out and we reported it. It was so easy, right? Well, if that's the way it works, if Trump tweets out, that becomes the news, and that's what people hear, then they're never hearing whether or not the policy actually works. Another example I gave was the endless reportage about Marine Le Pen in France, a person who never had a statistical chance greater than 0 of becoming president of France. And yet everybody has this feeling she posed a threat to French governance. And finally, now we're really getting close to home, scholars. Scholars kind of draft along behind the issues of the day, behaving in many respects a lot like journalists. They chase ambulances and purvey the conventional wisdom about these issues, pretty much saying across the board that this poses some kind of a fundamental threat. My own view is that they're forgetting their primary duty, which is to craft research based on empirically tested, medium-range, sober, longer-term expectations. And I think if people did that more, then at least discussions in rooms like this, and maybe even in the public realm, would be more sensible and more accurate in judging the threat that populism poses to foreign policy. Thank you.